The story begins with a woman who had lived through a lifetime of struggles, facing challenges that would have made many give up. She was a black woman, full of strength and wisdom, and she had never allowed herself to be defined by the obstacles in her path. In her community, she was known for being resilient, determined, and passionate about standing up for what was right. On the day her case was scheduled to be heard, she arrived at the courthouse with a heavy heart. She knew the battle ahead was going to be tough, but there was no turning back now. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for justice. She'd heard stories about the judge who would be presiding over her case. This judge had a reputation that no one could ignore. People said that he had a long history of unfairly ruling against people of color, and he wasn't subtle about his bias. His courtroom was a place where many felt powerless, where justice was often denied before it even had a chance to be heard. As she walked through the courthouse doors, her mind was clear. She had worked hard for this moment, countless hours of preparation, gathering evidence, and rehearsing her argument. But she knew that what she was up against wasn't just a legal battle. It was a battle against a system that had been built on years of injustice. She had learned early in life that people like her often had to work twice as hard to be heard, to be taken seriously, and to make sure their voices were not drowned out by others who were more powerful. But she was ready. She wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. The courtroom was quiet as she entered, and all eyes turned to her. The judge sat at the front of the room, his expression cold and distant. He was an older man with a reputation for ruling harshly. His eyes scanned the room briefly before turning to his papers, almost as though he expected this day to play out just like all the others. But this woman wasn't like everyone else. She had a fire inside her, a fire that could not be extinguished by a biased judge or an unfair system. As the case began, the woman sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, listening carefully to every word that was spoken. She took note of the judge's behavior, watching how he treated everyone in the room. She could see the subtle signs of bias in the way he addressed the lawyers and the witnesses. His tone was sharp, dismissive, and at times, downright disrespectful. It didn't take long for her to realize that he wasn't even trying to hide his prejudices. It was as if he had already made up his mind before the case had even begun. This was a moment she had prepared for, but it wasn't easy. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her, knowing that her success here could have far-reaching consequences. This case wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for every person who had ever been overlooked or treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all those who had been pushed aside, ignored, and silenced by people who held power in the wrong hands. Her lawyer made his opening statement, laying out the facts and presenting the evidence. But as the words left his mouth, she could already see how the judge's mind was closing. The judge barely acknowledged the points that were being raised. He wasn't interested in fairness or truth. He seemed more focused on maintaining control, on proving that his authority could not be challenged. And that was when the woman knew. This fight was going to be more difficult than she had anticipated. But she wasn't going to back down. In the depths of her heart, she knew this wasn't just a courtroom. It was a battleground. And she had the strength and the will to win. The woman sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, taking in every detail. Her eyes moved from the judge to the lawyers, to the few people scattered in the room. The tension in the air was thick, and it felt like every word spoken was weighed down by the fear of what might happen next. She wasn't just fighting for her case. She was fighting for every person who had been wronged by a system that wasn't always kind or fair. The judge's reputation was known to everyone in the courthouse. For years, people had whispered about his bias. Some even said he had been known to give harsher sentences to people of color, especially when they stood up for themselves or spoke out against unfair treatment. The judge was an older man, and his reputation had been built over decades. He had become known for making decisions that favored people in power, often disregarding the rights of others, especially those who didn't have the same privilege. His actions weren't hidden. They were clear for everyone to see. But despite all of this, he continued to rule from the bench with little accountability. The woman knew that she wasn't just standing up to one man. She was standing up to a system that had allowed people like him to continue without consequences for far too long. Her heart raced as she thought about the many people who had been hurt by his decisions. She thought of those who had come to court, only to leave feeling defeated, as though their voices had been silenced. She thought of the countless stories she had heard of people being unfairly treated, judged, and punished simply because of who they were. But she also knew that change didn't come easily. It came through people like her, people who refused to stay silent, people who were willing to fight for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. As the case went on, the woman listened closely to every argument, every piece of evidence. Her lawyer did his best to explain the facts of the case, pointing out how the judge's actions had been harmful and unjust. But the judge didn't seem to be paying attention. He barely acknowledged the lawyer's words, instead focusing on his papers, occasionally muttering something under his breath. It was clear to everyone in the room that he had already made up his mind. His actions were no longer about justice. They were about his own power and control. The woman clenched her fists, feeling a rush of frustration building inside her. She had worked so hard for this moment. She had gathered evidence, spoken to witnesses, and prepared for every possible challenge. But here she was, facing a judge who seemed determined to dismiss everything she had worked for. She could feel the weight of his disregard for the truth, and it made her want to scream. But she wasn't here to lose her temper. She was here to fight. She was here to make sure that justice was served, no matter what. The more she observed, the more she began to see a pattern. It wasn't just that the judge was being unfair. It was that he was deliberately ignoring the facts in front of him. He was allowing his own prejudices to cloud his judgment, and the woman wasn't about to let that slide. She had seen this kind of behavior before. She knew how easy it was for people in power to dismiss others, especially those who didn't have the same privileges. But she also knew that there was one thing more powerful than any bias or prejudice: the truth. As the morning dragged on, the woman began to feel a growing sense of determination. This wasn't just about her. This was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, everyone who had been denied their rights simply because of the color of their skin. She had seen how people like the judge could manipulate the system for their own benefit, but she also knew that there was a way to fight back. She could already feel the change in the air. The longer the case went on, the more she realized that the judge's own actions were becoming his undoing. With every biased comment, every dismissive gesture, he was revealing who he truly was, and she was ready to make sure the world saw it too. As the case moved forward, the tension in the courtroom began to grow thicker with every passing minute. The woman, sitting quietly and observing everything around her, knew that this moment was crucial. Her case was not just about her personal struggle. It was about something much bigger. It was about confronting a system that had allowed people like this judge to wield unchecked power for far too long. It was about making sure that no one else would have to face the same kind of unfair treatment that she was now enduring. The judge, sitting at the front of the room with his stern expression, had become a symbol of the very thing she was fighting against. He was the embodiment of the bias that ran deep in so many parts of the legal system. His actions spoke volumes. He barely looked at the lawyers, barely acknowledged the witnesses, and instead seemed to spend most of his time flipping through his papers, his mind clearly somewhere else. His attention was elsewhere, but his decisions were being made in real time, with little regard for the facts at hand. The woman couldn't help but notice the way the judge acted when certain people spoke. When a witness took the stand who seemed to challenge his view, the judge's tone turned cold and dismissive. But when someone spoke who agreed with his view, his demeanor changed. He became warmer, almost encouraging, as if validating everything they said. It was so obvious, so blatant, that even her lawyer tried his best to stay composed, presenting the facts and laying out the evidence. But with each passing moment, the judge grew more and more dismissive. His comments were sharp, and he began to interrupt more frequently, making it clear that he wasn't interested in hearing what was being said. The woman watched as her lawyer continued to argue, But it was clear that the judge wasn't listening. He wasn't even trying to hide his bias anymore. The woman could feel the frustration bubbling inside her. She had spent so many years studying, preparing, and gathering evidence, yet here she was, facing a judge who wasn't even bothering to do his job properly. She had worked tirelessly to build her case, to make sure that the facts spoke for themselves, but it was as if those facts didn't even matter in the face of the judge's prejudice. She was a woman of patience, but even she knew that there was a limit. Watching the judge's behavior, the way he treated everyone who dared to challenge him, made her realize that this wasn't just a matter of a bad day or a misunderstanding. This was part of a pattern, something that had been happening for years. The judge was intentionally ignoring the truth. He was allowing his biases to dictate his actions, and that was something she couldn't ignore any longer. The time had come for her to speak up. She had been quiet, observing, waiting for the right moment. But now, as the judge made yet another unfair comment, something inside her clicked. She wasn't going to stay silent anymore. She knew that if she didn't speak up now, the judge's actions would go unchecked, and the system would continue to allow this kind of injustice to thrive. With calm confidence, she stood up. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at her. She wasn't sure what the judge would do, but she knew she couldn't back down now. Her voice rang out, steady and clear, as she called out the judge's bias. She spoke of the unfairness she had witnessed, of how his actions were not only unjust, but were also harming the very system of justice he was meant to protect. The judge was taken aback by her boldness. For the first time in the entire proceeding, he looked directly at her. His usual smugness faltered for a moment, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The woman's heart was pounding, but she stood her ground. She wasn't there to make friends. She was there to make sure that truth was heard. She didn't just call him out for his unfair treatment. She called him out for the way he had allowed the system to become tainted by personal prejudice. She spoke of the many people who had come before him, people who had been treated unfairly because of their race, their background, or their beliefs. Her words weren't just about her. They were about everyone who had ever faced this kind of injustice. For a moment, there was silence in the courtroom. It felt as if the weight of her words hung in the air. The judge, though momentarily caught off guard, quickly tried to regain control. But it was clear now. His actions were no longer hidden. His prejudice had been exposed for all to see, and there was no going back. The courtroom was silent after the woman stood up and boldly addressed the judge. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. The judge, visibly shocked by her direct challenge, paused for a moment, trying to regain his composure. The woman had spoken with a calm authority that had caught him off guard, and for the first time in the entire case, he looked uncertain. For a moment, the tension was palpable. The judge slowly placed his glasses down on the desk, his fingers tapping nervously. His usual confident, dismissive demeanor had been shattered. He wasn't used to being questioned in this way, especially not in his own courtroom. But the woman, standing tall, wasn't about to back down. She had made her point, and she was going to make sure it was heard by everyone present. Her words had struck a nerve. The room was now filled with a quiet intensity, and even the lawyers seemed to pause in their thoughts, giving the woman a moment to stand firm in what she had just said. The woman knew she had just taken a risk, but she also knew it was necessary. This wasn't just about her case anymore. It was about exposing the deep-seated bias that had governed so many decisions in that courtroom. The judge, clearly rattled, tried to recover quickly, clearing his throat and attempting to reassert control over the situation. He shifted in his chair, his voice a little sharper now as he addressed the woman. "I will not tolerate disrespect in my courtroom," he said, his words heavy with authority. But it was clear that the calm certainty he once carried had been replaced by uncertainty. He was on the defensive. The woman didn't flinch. She had prepared herself for this moment, and she wasn't going to let the judge intimidate her or silence her. She calmly replied, "Respect goes both ways. Your actions speak louder than your words, and you have shown no respect to me or anyone who has come before you in this courtroom." Her voice was steady, But every word carried the weight of years of frustration and the courage to finally speak up. It wasn't just her that she was standing up for. It was for every person who had ever been ignored, dismissed, or mistreated by those in power. The silence in the room grew even more intense as the judge seemed to struggle with his next move. He tried to dismiss her challenge with a wave of his hand, as though it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, but the damage had already been done. The people in the room were no longer just following the rules of the courtroom. They were watching. They were listening. And the judge could feel the eyes of everyone on him. His earlier confidence had vanished, and the more he tried to reassert control, the more he revealed his own weakness. The woman's words had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of everyone in the room. The people who had been silent, unsure of how to react to the judge's behavior, were now beginning to see the truth of what she had said. His actions could no longer be brushed off as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. This wasn't a single moment of bias. It was a pattern that had been happening for years, and the woman had just brought it into the light. The judge knew he couldn't just ignore her challenge. His pride and authority were at stake now, and that was something he wasn't used to. He had built his career on power and control, but now that foundation was cracking. He tried to regain his footing by turning to the lawyer representing the woman's case, dismissing her challenge as a simple misunderstanding. But even as he spoke, his voice lacked the same conviction it had earlier. The doubt was creeping in, and it was clear that his usual tactics weren't going to work this time. The woman remained calm, but inside, she felt a surge of determination. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She knew that the judge would do everything in his power to maintain his position, to try to dismiss her challenge as an act of disrespect. But she wasn't going to let him. She wasn't going to let him get away with it. Her lawyer, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, jumped in with new evidence that further highlighted the judge's bias. He presented witnesses who had come forward to share their stories of being treated unfairly in the judge's courtroom. Each new piece of evidence was like a hammer striking the judge's carefully built image of impartiality. The more they presented, the more it became clear that the woman's challenge had been valid. The judge wasn't just biased in this case. He had been biased for years, and now it was all coming to light. The room was now filled with a sense of momentum. The judge, no longer in control, tried to salvage the situation. But it was too late. His credibility had been damaged, and the people in the courtroom were starting to see the truth. The woman had done what many before her had failed to do. She had exposed the judge for who he really was. And there was no going back. As the courtroom settled into an uneasy silence, the judge's frustration became more visible. The woman had challenged his authority, and now he found himself struggling to regain control of a situation that was quickly slipping away from him. His attempts to dismiss the evidence and the accusations against him were becoming more desperate, but each attempt seemed to only dig him deeper into a hole. His usual arrogance had vanished, replaced by a growing unease. It was clear that the woman's words had struck a nerve. Her lawyer, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, pressed forward with more evidence, making it clear that the judge's actions weren't isolated or accidental. The more they presented, the more it became apparent that the judge's behavior wasn't just a matter of personal bias. It was part of a larger, systematic issue. People who had faced the judge in the past began to come forward, sharing their experiences of being treated unfairly, often for no reason other than the color of their skin or their background. Each story built upon the last, painting a disturbing picture of a man who had been entrusted with power but had used it to maintain his own prejudices. The witnesses weren't just recounting their experiences. They were providing evidence, facts that could not be ignored. The more the judge tried to deflect, the more the truth began to stand out, undeniable and clear. The woman could feel the tide turning in her favor. The doubt that had once been hidden in the courtroom now bubbled to the surface. It was as if the judge's previous authority had been chipped away piece by piece, leaving nothing but the cold truth in its place. She had known from the beginning that this wasn't going to be easy, but seeing the judge struggle, seeing his carefully constructed image crumble, filled her with a sense of justice that she had longed for. She had spent years fighting against a system that seemed to turn a blind eye to the people who needed it most, and now, for the first time, she could see that change might actually be within reach. Her lawyer stood strong, calmly presenting each piece of evidence with precision. The witnesses, one by one, told their stories with quiet confidence, unafraid to speak the truth, even when it meant exposing the man who had so often held the power over their lives. And as each story unfolded, the woman felt more and more certain that they were on the right path. This wasn't just about winning her case. It was about making sure that no one else would have to face the same kind of injustice she had. As the last of the witnesses finished speaking, the courtroom was quiet once more. All eyes were on the judge. He had no choice but to listen now. His earlier dismissals had been replaced with a growing silence, one that seemed to weigh down on him. He glanced at the woman, who had remained calm and composed throughout the entire ordeal. She had shown no fear, no hesitation, and that made her all the more powerful in this moment. The judge could no longer hide behind his authority or his bias. The truth was out there, and it was undeniable. For the first time, the judge seemed to lose his grip on the situation. His hands, once steady, now trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses, scanning the evidence in front of him. It was clear that he could no longer ignore the growing tide of truth. His actions, his prejudice, were all laid out before him, and there was no way to deny it. The woman's heart raced as she watched the judge struggle. She knew that this moment was critical. It was a defining moment not only for her, but for everyone who had been wronged by him. She had seen the way the system worked, how people in power could hide their biases behind rules and regulations. But today was different. Today, the truth had come forward, and the judge could no longer escape it. The judge sat back in his chair, his face pale, his mind clearly racing. He was no longer the confident figure he had once been. The courtroom was now waiting for him to make a decision, but everyone knew that his decision was no longer in his hands alone. The truth, the evidence, the witnesses, they had all spoken louder than any authority he could impose. For the first time in what felt like forever, the power in the room wasn't his. It was in the hands of the woman who had stood up and refused to back down. The woman felt a quiet sense of triumph. She wasn't just fighting for justice today. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been ignored or mistreated, and she knew that her victory would send a message far beyond this courtroom. No longer would people like the judge be able to hide behind their power. The truth had been spoken, and it had changed everything. The courtroom was still, the air thick with anticipation. The woman, standing strong, could feel the tension in the room. All eyes were on the judge as he sat silently, staring at the pile of evidence before him. He seemed to be struggling to find a way out of the situation. His earlier confidence had completely faded, replaced by a growing realization that he was no longer in control. The evidence, the witnesses, and the woman's bold challenge had exposed his biases, and there was nothing he could do to hide from it now. For a long moment, the judge didn't speak. He merely adjusted his glasses, his mind clearly racing. He knew that if he made the wrong decision now, it could end his career. More importantly, it could damage the very system he had spent years building his reputation on. But as the silence stretched on, it became clear that his position was no longer tenable. The truth was right in front of him, and ignoring it wasn't an option. The woman stood with a quiet confidence. She had been patient throughout this entire process, but now she could sense the power of the moment. It was as if everything had led to this point: the evidence, the witnesses, her own courage. She had spent so many years feeling powerless, watching as people like the judge used their authority to push others down. But today was different. Today, she had found her voice, and the world was listening. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had already said what needed to be said. She had already shown the judge, and everyone else in the room, how his actions were nothing short of unjust. Now, all she had to do was wait, and see if the truth would be enough to change everything. The judge took a deep breath, his hand shaking slightly as he picked up a piece of paper from the stack in front of him. The woman watched him closely, sensing that the moment of decision was coming. Her lawyer stood beside her, waiting just as intently, knowing that they had done everything they could to make sure the truth was heard. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice lacking the usual authority it once had. "I have reviewed the evidence," he began slowly, "and I understand the concerns that have been raised." His words were measured, as though he was trying to keep control of a situation that was quickly slipping away from him. But the woman could hear the cracks in his voice. He was no longer the powerful figure who had sat on that bench with certainty. Now he was just a man, trying to hold on to the power he had once taken for granted. The woman felt a small surge of hope. She knew this wasn't over yet, but the fact that he had acknowledged the evidence meant something. It meant that he could no longer pretend that his actions had no consequences. The system might have allowed him to act with bias for years, but today was different. Today, there were people who were willing to stand up to him. The judge continued, but his words now sounded hesitant. "While I do not take lightly the claims that have been made," he said, his voice wavering, "I must consider the larger implications of this case." The woman could feel her lawyer's hand subtly tighten on her shoulder. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. Would the judge take responsibility for his actions, or would he try to defend his previous decisions? The room waited in suspense. The woman's thoughts were racing. She had come so far, but she knew that the final decision would define everything. This wasn't just about winning a case, it was about holding the system accountable. She thought of all the people who had been silenced over the years, all the voices that had been drowned out by power and prejudice. This was her chance to make sure they were no longer ignored. The judge seemed to struggle with his next words. I will review the evidence further," he said, his voice sounding weaker now. The woman's heart sank for a moment. She had hoped for a swift decision, but the judge wasn't ready to make a final ruling just yet. Still, she knew that the truth had done its job. Even if he didn't immediately take action, the seed of doubt had been planted, and he could no longer ignore the reality of the situation. The woman looked around the room, at the people who had gathered to watch this battle for justice. She realized something in that moment. This fight was bigger than her. It was about every person who had ever been denied their voice, every person who had been silenced by power. She had spoken out, and now the world was listening. Whether the judge made the right decision or not, the truth had already been laid bare. The change she had fought for had already begun. The courtroom was tense, filled with an uneasy quiet as everyone waited for the judge to make his final decision. The woman could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. After all the evidence, all the witnesses, and everything that had been said, it was now up to the judge to decide. She had made her case, and she had made sure the truth had been heard. But would it be enough? Would the judge do the right thing? She stood tall, her back straight, her mind racing as she tried to stay calm. She had spent so many years feeling powerless, but today she felt something different. Hope. Hope that things could change. Hope that her voice, and the voices of those who had spoken out, could make a real difference. She had seen the way the judge's confidence had cracked during the trial, the way his authority had been slowly chipped away with every bit of evidence that was presented. It was clear to her now that the truth was no longer something that could be ignored. The judge, sitting at his desk, looked down at the papers in front of him. His hands trembled slightly as he reviewed the evidence one last time. He had been given every opportunity to make the right choice, and now, the decision was his. But the more he looked at the facts, the more he realized that there was no way to deny what had been laid out before him. The truth was staring him in the face, and he couldn't pretend that his bias and his past actions could be swept away any longer. For a long time, it seemed as if nothing would happen. The judge just sat there, lost in thought, as the courtroom waited in complete silence. The woman could feel the eyes of everyone on her, but she didn't look away from the judge. She was determined to stay strong. No matter what the outcome, she had already won in many ways. The judge may have held the power to make the final decision, but the truth was now out in the open, and that alone had made a difference. Finally, the judge cleared his throat. He slowly stood up, the room still silent as everyone waited for him to speak. He adjusted his glasses and began. After reviewing the evidence and considering the testimonies of all the witnesses, I have come to a conclusion, the judge said, his voice much softer than it had been before. The woman's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. The judge paused, almost as if he was weighing his words carefully. The silence in the room felt deafening, and every person in the courtroom seemed to hold their breath. The woman could feel her palms sweating, but she remained focused, waiting for what would come next. Would he make the right choice? Would he take responsibility for his actions? I acknowledge, the judge continued, that there have been issues raised about my conduct in the courtroom. I acknowledge that my actions and decisions have been questioned, and that there is merit to those concerns. The words hit like a hammer, and the woman felt a surge of relief. It wasn't a victory yet, but the judge had admitted the truth. He had acknowledged the wrongdoing. Her lawyer gave her a quick look, a silent nod of encouragement. This was a moment of reckoning, and it was clear that the judge was beginning to realize the gravity of the situation. The woman couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was the power of standing up for what was right. She had taken the risk. She had fought against a system that tried to silence her. And now she was seeing the result of that courage. The judge continued, his voice now more measured. In light of this, I will be stepping down from this case. A new judge will be assigned to review the evidence and make a fair ruling. The woman's heart soared. This wasn't just a small victory. It was a major step forward. The judge had taken responsibility for his actions and had acknowledged the need for change. It wasn't everything she had hoped for, but it was enough for now. The process of accountability had begun, and that was something she had longed to see. The courtroom was silent for a moment, as everyone processed what had just happened. The judge's decision to step down wasn't just about this case. It was about sending a message. It was a message to everyone in the room, and to the world, that justice mattered, that truth mattered, and that no one, no matter how powerful, could ignore it forever. The woman felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had done it. She had stood up against injustice and had forced the system to take notice. It wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been wronged, everyone who had ever felt silenced or overlooked. The truth had won today, and with it came the hope that change was possible. The decision had been made. The judge's acknowledgement of his misconduct had sent a ripple through the courtroom. The woman stood there, processing the moment, still unsure if she could fully believe what had just happened. For years, she had witnessed injustice, had felt the sting of being overlooked. But now, for the first time, there was a sense that the system might actually hold someone accountable. As the judge formally stepped down, the courtroom began to buzz with a mix of disbelief and relief. Lawyers exchanged quiet words with each other, and some of the audience members who had been present throughout the trial seemed to let out a collective sigh of relief. The woman remained calm, but inside, her heart raced. She had fought for so long, and now it seemed that her fight was starting to pay off. Her lawyer gently placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with pride. "You did it," he said quietly, but his words meant the world to her. She smiled, her heart swelling with a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. The judge's decision to step down wasn't the end of the battle, but it was a crucial turning point. A new judge would now be assigned to the case, one who would be expected to approach it with fairness and without the biases that had tainted the previous proceedings. This wasn't just about this single case anymore. It was about sending a clear message to the entire justice system. It was a message that no one, no matter how powerful or untouchable they seemed, was beyond reproach. The truth could not be hidden, and those who were entrusted with power had to be held accountable. As the courtroom began to clear, the woman stood in place for a moment longer, collecting her thoughts. She knew that the road ahead wasn't easy, and that the fight for justice was far from over. But today, she had made a difference. Today, she had helped shine a light on the biases that had existed for too long, and she had shown that change was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Outside the courtroom, reporters had gathered, eager to hear from the woman who had brought the judge to his knees. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the attention, but she knew this moment was important. She couldn't let it pass without using her voice to speak for all those who had been silenced before her. As she walked toward the reporters, her lawyer beside her, the woman felt a sense of pride. "Today," she began, her voice steady, "is not just a victory for me. It's a victory for anyone who has ever been mistreated, anyone who has ever felt powerless. The system is not perfect, but it can change. We just have to be brave enough to fight for it." Her words were simple, but they resonated with those who had gathered to listen. The reporters scribbled notes, capturing her message of hope and justice. The woman had become more than just a person fighting for her own case. She had become a symbol of what could happen when someone stood up and demanded change. The truth had prevailed, and her bravery had sparked a conversation that could not be ignored. As the crowd of reporters slowly dispersed, the woman and her lawyer made their way out of the courthouse. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. It felt like the world was just a little bit brighter, a little bit more hopeful. The fight wasn't over, but today she had made her mark. She had shown that standing up for what's right could make a difference. She had fought for herself, but she had also fought for everyone who had ever felt voiceless, for everyone who had ever felt dismissed by the very system meant to protect them. And as she walked away from the courthouse, the woman knew that this was just the beginning. The journey was far from over, but she was no longer afraid to walk it. She had found her voice, and she was ready to use it for the greater good. The fight for justice would continue, but now it had one more warrior.